I woke before the sun, the air still cold enough to sting when I breathed, and for a moment I simply stood in the kitchen holding my travel mug, trying to steady my hands as I reread the appointment reminder glowing on my phone screen. Today was the day I would finally get answers about the lump in my neck, the one that had grown harder and more noticeable each week until swallowing felt like dragging sandpaper down my throat. The house was silent except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the faint knock of branches against the window. I tightened my scarf carefully to hide the swelling on my neck and rehearsed what I would tell the specialist if they asked about my symptoms again. I did not expect the sound of pounding feet overhead. Evan came crashing down the stairs like a storm, his voice already raised, vibrating with the same wild impatience he had carried since childhood. He yelled from the landing, demanding that I cancel the appointment because he needed a ride to a semi-pro baseball tryout across town. He did not greet me or ask how I was or even look at the phone in my shaking hand. He simply barked orders as if I were a household appliance that owed him function. I said no. The word came out smaller than I intended, but steady, the kind of steady that comes from exhaustion rather than confidence. My rejection hit him harder than any physical blow ever could have. His head jerked back and his eyes widened like I had committed some unspeakable betrayal. He stomped into the kitchen until he stood inches from me, his breath warm and sour with last night's beer as he demanded again that I take him. I told him I needed to go to the hospital, and I tried to step around him, but he blocked my path with his entire body, shoulders squared and fists already tight. He told me his opportunity mattered more than anything happening to me. He told me I was selfish for putting myself first. I said no a second time. That was when his expression shifted from rage to something darker, something sharper, something that made the air between us tighten like a drawn wire. I barely had time to register the movement of his arm. His fist struck my cheek with a sharp crack that echoed across the tile, and my vision flared white, then black as my body flew sideways, slamming into the edge of the kitchen counter. Pain burst across the side of my skull and rolled through me in a wave that made my knees buckle. I felt the cold floor rush up to meet me, and the taste of copper flooded my mouth as everything went dim around the edges. Voices filtered in from somewhere far away. My mother telling me to get up and stop being dramatic. My father saying that Evan could not miss his tryout again and that I always ruined things. They said none of this with concern or urgency. Their voices floated above me like commentary on a television show they had seen too many times to care about. I blinked slowly until the ceiling came into focus, pale and cracked in the corner from a long, ignored leak. My cheek throbbed so hard my eyes watered on reflex. I touched my jaw and winced at the swollen ridge forming beneath the skin. My head pounded with every heartbeat, and for a moment I thought I might vomit. Evan was already snatching his gear from the front hall, muttering curses about how he should not have to deal with this kind of nonsense. My father handed him the spare keys to the family truck. My mother smoothed his jacket like this morning had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience on his path to glory. None of them looked at me. None of them checked if I was conscious. I pulled myself up on shaking elbows until I could sit upright. My fingers left a small smear of blood on the floor that caught the morning light. My breath trembled as I tried to steady it, and somewhere deep inside me, something shifted with a quiet, decisive click. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand and forced myself to stand, even though my legs trembled and the room tilted slightly left. Every sound felt muffled and distant, except for the ringing in my ears. I held the counter until the dizziness settled into a dull swirl. I looked toward the doorway where my parents stood watching Evan leave like he was heading into a championship game instead of walking out on the sister he had just knocked unconscious. My mother turned to me finally and said that I needed to stop making everything about myself and that I should have taken him. My father added that his future mattered and I needed to support him if I wanted the family to succeed. Their voices felt like cold water poured down my spine. Something inside me cracked, not loud or dramatic, just a small, clean break that had been forming for years. I looked down at my palms still trembling and felt an unexpected stillness settle across my chest. I said nothing as they walked away. I said nothing as the front door slammed behind Evan. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, surrounded by the fading echo of violence, and tried to understand how many years I had spent shrinking myself to fit within these walls. I touched the swelling on my cheek again and whispered to myself a quiet promise. If your family has ever told you that someone else deserves more than your health, your safety, your very breath, stay with me. This is the moment everything changed, even if none of them knew it yet. The clock on the microwave blinked 7:30. I picked up my bag slowly and turned toward the hallway, knowing that the life I would walk back into after today would not be the same one I woke into this morning. I pressed my palm to the growing swell on my cheek and felt the warmth pulsing beneath the skin, a dull, rhythmic soreness that matched the pounding inside my skull. For a moment, I just stood there in the hallway, my breath shallow, listening to the sound of the truck engine revving in the driveway as Evan sped off without a single glance back. The house settled into its usual quiet, but it felt different now, heavier, as if every wall around me had absorbed the truth I had refused to see for years. I took one slow step toward my bedroom, then another, each footfall sending a faint jolt of pain up my spine where I had hit the floor. The world around me tilted slightly, and I reached out to steady myself on the wall, leaving a faint smudge of red from the dried blood on my knuckles. My reflection caught my eye in the hallway mirror. My hair was tangled from the fall, my lip had a thin line of dried blood along the edge, and the bruise on my cheek was already starting to bloom. I looked like someone I did not recognize, someone who had been holding herself together with fragile threads for far too long. I told myself to breathe. I told myself to stay upright. I told myself that walking away from them was impossible, and yet suddenly the most possible thing in the world. From the kitchen, I could still hear the faint echo of my mother's voice telling me that I had ruined the morning and that I always caused problems. The same rhythm of blame I had heard since childhood. Her words wrapped around me like cold vines, tugging me back into my place in their world. But something in my chest resisted something I had not felt in years, a small, rising heat that pushed against the weight of their voices. I reached my bedroom and closed the door quietly, not to hide, but to think. My bag sat on the chair where I had left it last night. My medical papers were stacked neatly beside it, everything ready for the appointment I had waited what felt like a lifetime for. The specialist was the only person who had seemed to take my symptoms seriously, the only person who had said they intended to get me answers. That mattered more than anything happening downstairs. I sat on the edge of my bed and let my fingers trace the envelope containing the referral papers. My throat tightened. I thought about every time I had put myself second, because they told me family comes first, though what they really meant was that I should bend my life around whatever Evan needed regardless of the cost to me. I thought about how many nights I stayed late at work to cover bills that were not mine. How many weekends I canceled plans because they needed something. How many times I had pushed aside my own fear about the lump in my neck because there was no space for me to worry about myself in that house. I felt the sting behind my eyes but forced myself not to cry. Tears were wasted in this place. I stood again and walked slowly back into the hallway. Every step reminded me of the hit that had knocked me out, a sharp reminder that my body had limits, even if my family pretended I did not. As I passed the kitchen doorway, I heard my father muttering under his breath about how I needed to toughen up and how I always took things too personally. He did not see me. I did not speak. I understood in that moment that explaining myself had never mattered here. They had already chosen the story they wanted to believe, and I would always be the villain in it if I showed even a hint of resistance. I touched the bruise on my cheek again and looked toward the front door. The morning sunlight spilled through the glass dust floating in the beam like tiny suspended stars. It felt like an invitation, a way out, a promise I had never dared consider. I stepped closer to the door and rested my hand against the frame. My mind played back the moment his fist connected with my face, the shock, the burst of light, the sudden darkness, the way he did not hesitate, the way they did not care. I whispered to myself not as comfort, but as truth. I will not stay where I am harmed. I will not remain where I am invisible. If you have ever been told that someone else in your family deserves more than you, more than your health, more than your safety, then you already understand what I felt in that kitchen. If you have ever heard that your pain is an inconvenience or that your needs come second, then you know the quiet humiliation and the slow burning anger that settles deep in your ribs. If you have ever been knocked down by someone who claims to love you, then you know the strange clarity that comes right after the impact when your body hurts, but your mind awakens. That was exactly what washed over me as I stood there with my hand on the front door frame, the imprint of my brother's fist throbbing beneath my skin. I took a long breath and let it out slowly. My voice was barely louder than a whisper as I spoke to the silent, empty room. They do not know it yet, but this is the moment I leave their world. This is the moment I stop pretending that their dreams matter more than my life. This is the moment I choose myself for the first time. I picked up my bag and wiped my cheek gently where it still ached. The promise settled itself inside me with a calm finality. Stay with me. If you have ever had to walk away from the people who raised you in order to save yourself, then you already know that the story ahead is not gentle. But it is true, and it is mine. I used to believe that families were supposed to be soft places to land the kind of places you could collapse into when the world felt heavy. But in my house, softness was treated like weakness, and weakness was something to be scrubbed out of you long before you understood what it meant. Growing up felt less like living in a home and more like moving through a series of unspoken rules that all revolved around one person, and it was never me. Evan arrived like a comet, bright and loud, and destined, at least according to my parents, for some mythical greatness. They fed the story of his potential to anyone who would listen. Coaches, neighbors, teachers, cashiers at the grocery store, and relatives we only saw on holidays. Everywhere we went, the conversation circled back to him, to his talent, to the idea that one day he would lift all of us into a better life just by throwing a ball. The yard behind our house used to be an uneven patch of weeds and dirt, but my father tore it apart one summer to build a makeshift baseball training ground complete with a netted cage and a pitching mound made out of bags of cement he shaped himself. The rest of us were expected to admire it like a shrine. My weekends were spent at watching my father clap loudly while Evan practiced pitching until the sun went down, the repeated thump of the ball against the net echoing through the house long after dinner dishes were washed. There were pictures of him lining the hallway, framed shots of him gripping a bat, tossing a ball, smiling with streaks of dirt across his cheek. There was not a single photograph of me alone on the walls. When I asked about it once, my mother said dismissively that I was not the type who cared about things like that. I think she believed that because I never asked for anything. I learned early that asking simply meant being told no, or being told that Evan needed it more. When I was old enough to start school, I realized most children had bedrooms of their own. I slept in the basement where the air was always cold and the light bulb flickered whenever the washing machine ran. They told me the upstairs rooms were needed for storage or for Evan's equipment or for guests who never came. I decorated the cinder block walls with cutouts from old magazines and index cards covered in my handwriting. I wrote reminders to myself to study, to stay quiet, to work hard, to be the reasonable one. My parents praised me often, but their praise sounded like obligation, not affection. They liked that I never caused trouble, that I did not ask for rides to friends' houses, that I did not join expensive extracurriculars, that I did not need them the way Evan did. They said I was mature. What they meant was that I was invisible. When I started showing talent in math, my teachers encouraged me to join clubs, competitions, tutoring programs, but programs cost money and competitions required travel and tutoring needed fees, so I stopped mentioning opportunities after the first few rejections. Instead, I worked small jobs in the neighborhood watching kids mowing lawns, anything that earned enough for school supplies or the occasional thrift store sweater. My parents did not ask how I paid for these things, and I did not volunteer the information. I learned silence made the house smoother. When Evan started joining more serious teams, my parents rearranged the family budget and then eventually rearranged my life to accommodate his travel schedule. Some months, my mother pressured me to pick up extra hours at my part-time job so I could help cover gas or hotel fees for out-of-state tournaments. She told me it was what good siblings did. She said I should feel proud to contribute to something bigger than myself. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to feel part of something. But I saw how she looked at Evan with a pride she never reserved for me, and I knew I was not contributing to a family dream. I was subsidizing a fantasy that had swallowed every part of our lives. Holidays were always shaped around his tournaments. Birthdays were always adjusted around his practice schedules. When I graduated high school, they congratulated me politely, but did not come to the ceremony because Evan had an important game scheduled. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I understood. I told myself things would feel different once I moved out. But when I did move out, when I got my first apartment and my first full-time job independence, did not feel like liberation. It felt like transferring all the weight I carried in childhood into a new container. Every time my mother called, she needed something. The electric bill was high. They fell behind on payments for one of Evan's programs. The truck needed repairs again. Could I cover it just this once? It never stopped at once. It always turned into a pattern. A month, then 3 months, then a year of helping in whatever way they asked because refusing felt like betrayal. I told myself helping was temporary. I told myself things would change once Evan signed with a real team. I told myself their promises were genuine. They said they would repay me. They said they appreciated me. They said Evan would take care of all of us someday. I learned to hold those promises lightly because they always slipped through my fingers. I worked long hours as a junior accountant in the city. I liked the routine, the order, the clear patterns and numbers that always made sense. Unlike the shifting justifications in my family, I began building a life for myself in small, careful steps. But every time I found a moment to breathe, my phone would buzz with another request. Another crisis that needed my attention. Another bill that needed paying. Another problem born out of Evan's choices that somehow landed in my lap. I kept telling myself I was doing the right thing by helping. That family meant sacrifice. That things would even out eventually. But deep down, I felt the faint, slow drain, like a leak beneath a sink you ignore, because tightening the pipes seems harder than catching the drips. The more I gave, the more they expected. The more I tried to hold things together, the more they disagreed with the way I held them. I swallowed every disappointment because speaking up never changed anything. I saw the way my mother shined with pride whenever Evan walked into a room. The way my father rearranged his entire week for a 10-minute conversation with Evan's coach. They treated his potential like a treasure and treated me like a durable tool that could withstand any pressure. I told myself I was tough. I told myself I did not need what he needed. I told myself the lump in my neck was nothing, because if I admitted fear, it would be dismissed. And yet somewhere in me, a quiet voice whispered that being tolerated was not the same as being loved. I silenced that voice for years, convinced it was weakness. But standing alone in the hallway that morning, bruised and dizzy, I finally understood that it had always been the truth. I used to think childhood was something you looked back on with a kind of blurry warmth, the kind that makes people sigh during small talk and say things like, "Those were simpler times." But mine always felt like standing in a room where the lights were on for everyone but me. From the start, everything in our house orbited around my brother and his potential, a word my parents used endlessly like a prophecy that would one day deliver us from ordinary life. They spoke of his future, the way some people speak of religion with absolute, unquestioned faith. And faith does not require fairness, only devotion. When I was very young, I did not fully understand the imbalance. I only knew that certain needs of mine were treated like interruptions while every whim of his was treated like a necessity. If he cried, everyone rushed. If I cried, someone told me to toughen up. If he wanted something, we found a way. If I wanted something, we talked about responsibility and sacrifice. Our house had a rhythm to it, one built on the bounce of a ball and the loud praise my father offered whenever Evan made some minor improvement in his throwing mechanics. The sound of a baseball slamming into a net was the soundtrack of my childhood, echoing through the vents, shaking dust from the rafters, filling the basement where I slept in a narrow bed pushed against a cement wall that always felt cold no matter the season. My mother called it the practical choice because it left the upstairs rooms free for storage and equipment, as if my presence took up too much valuable space. I made that basement into something livable with what little I had, taping notes to the walls and stacking books on milk crates, but it never felt like a room belonging to someone expected to thrive. It felt like a place where you put things you did not want to think about. School became my sanctuary when I was old enough to realize I could be seen there in ways I never was at home. Teachers noticed when I worked hard. They praised me not because they expected greatness from me, but because I earned it. They encouraged me to join clubs, to apply for programs, to push myself academically. But after a while, I stopped telling my parents about these things. The answer was always the same. We cannot afford it. We have to save for Evan's training. We have to book travel for his next tournament. We have to buy new gear. Everything was always for him. The word we never seemed to include me. I remember one winter when the furnace broke and our house filled with the sharp metallic smell of cold air pushing through vents that no longer produced heat. We spent a week wrapped in layers of blankets while my parents complained about repair costs, but when Evan's glove ripped during practice, my father replaced it the very next day without hesitation. I remember sitting at the kitchen table doing homework when my mother told me she needed me to pick up a weekend shift at the grocery store where I bagged groceries because they were short on money again. I said yes, automatically the way I always did, even though I had a math competition that weekend one my teacher had been preparing me for months. I did not tell anyone about the competition. I did the shift, handed my mother the cash, and did not mention the disappointment lodged in my throat. At dinner that night, my father congratulated Evan for throwing a few miles faster than usual, declaring the day a huge success. No one asked how my day was. I told myself that this was normal, that being the dependable one was my place in the family. I learned to minimize myself, to shrink my needs until they became invisible. I learned to say it's fine even when it wasn't. I learned to smile politely when my mother bragged about my responsibility, as if it were something she had nurtured, rather than something I had been forced into. When I graduated high school, I hoped something would change, that they might see me as someone with her own path, rather than someone who existed to support Evans. My graduation ceremony felt like a turning point in theory, but in reality they were hundreds of miles away at one of his tournaments. I walked across the stage alone, holding my diploma with a practiced smile that hid the hollow disappointment settling in my chest. My mother sent a text filled with exclamation points, apologizing and reminding me how important this opportunity was for him. She said she hoped I understood. Eventually, that sentence became a refrain in our house. I hope you understand. I understood too well. I understood that their love had conditions. I understood that affection was reserved for the child they chose as their legacy. I understood that my usefulness depended entirely on how well I could support someone else's goals. When I entered the workforce, I felt a strange pride at building something of my own. The routine comforted me. Numbers made sense. They did not lie the way people do. They did not shift based on who needed more attention. They obeyed rules and patterns and expectations, unlike the unpredictable demands my family placed on me. I hoped distance would soften the imbalance between us, but instead, it sharpened it. My parents learned to treat me as an emergency fund they could tap into whenever Evan had a setback or needed something. His batting coach raised his fees again. The truck required repairs. Travel costs increased. There was always something, and I was always the solution. They framed these requests as obligations of love, insisting that supporting Evan was supporting the family. Any time I hesitated, they accused me of being selfish or resentful or ungrateful. They praised me only when I said yes and punished me with silence or criticism when I pushed back. Years blurred into a long stretch of giving more than I had. I worked late, came home tired, budgeted tightly, and pretended not to notice how often my mother called only when she needed something. Conversations rarely ended with "How are you?" They ended with "Can you help?" The turning point came quietly long before the morning Evan struck me. It came one night when I was sorting through bills and realized I could list every one of their expenses by memory, but struggled to remember the last time anyone had asked about the lump forming in my neck. It had been months by then, growing steadily, pressing against my throat in a way that made it harder to ignore. I mentioned it once at dinner, and my father waved it away, telling me I was young and stress could do strange things to the body. My mother said she hoped I would not let something small derail Evan's focus before a big tournament. That was when the quiet truth settled over me. I was not a daughter in their eyes. I was a foundation stone for a house built on dreams that were never mine. A tool, a shadow, a means to an end. And shadows are easy to disregard until they step into the light. I first noticed the lump on an ordinary morning, the kind where routine feels so familiar that any disruption becomes impossible to ignore. I was brushing my teeth before work when my fingers grazed a small, hard knot just beneath the curve of my jaw. It was the size of a grape at first, firm and unmoving under the skin. I pressed it lightly, expecting it to shift, expecting it to be nothing more than a swollen gland from a mild cold, but it stayed rigid, and a strange chill worked its way through my chest. I stood frozen for a moment, toothbrush in hand, foam dripping down the side of the sink, thinking about how something so small could create such sudden fear. I told myself not to panic. I told myself to be rational. I made an appointment with our family doctor, the same one who had seen us through sprained ankles, seasonal allergies, and Evan's countless sports injuries. When he examined my neck, his expression changed in a way he tried to hide, the kind of subtle shift you only notice if you are hurtling toward a truth you are not ready to face. He ordered blood work and imaging, and when the results came back inconclusive, he referred me to a specialist. He said it with gentle caution, not wanting to alarm me, but knowing there was something about that lump that needed a closer look. That night at dinner, I sat across from my parents and tried to bring it up casually, my voice careful and neutral, as if speaking too honestly would make it more real. I said the doctor wanted me to see a specialist for a biopsy. My mother barely glanced up from her phone. She asked if the appointment would interfere with Evan's training schedule. My father shrugged and said stress could manifest physically, that I needed to relax, that young people worry too much. I tried to explain, but their attention had already shifted to a text message from Evan about needing new cleats before a weekend tournament. The conversation dissolved before it even began. I drove home that night with a quiet dread pooling in my stomach. I tried to swallow and felt the lump press back a foreign presence that did not care about timing or logistics or the dreams my parents clung to. I spent the next few months on waiting lists because specialists are booked out far in advance in my city. Every receptionist I spoke to apologized for delays far beyond their control. Week by week, the lump grew slightly enough to alter the shape of my neck when I looked in the mirror. I noticed it when I turned my head, when I swallowed, when I tried to sleep and it pressed against the pillow. I learned to press 2 fingers lightly against it to reassure myself it was still the same size, even though deep down I knew it was changing. I did not tell my family again. I had learned by then that their concern was rationed exclusively for Evan. Whenever I mentioned the appointment process, my mother sighed dramatically or accused me of timing things deliberately to distract the household from his upcoming tournaments. My father said things like, "You are overthinking this and you need to stay strong for the family." For weeks, I swallowed discomfort and fear along with every meal. I told myself I was imagining it when my voice cracked on certain words. I forced myself to believe the lump was benign even as my anxiety crowded the edges of my thoughts. I kept working, kept paying bills, kept helping my parents whenever they called. I tried to bring up the lump again once after a long day when I felt particularly worn down. My mother interrupted before I finished my sentence and launched into a story about how Evan had been scouted by a new coach with connections to a semi-pro league. She said opportunities like that were rare. She said we all had to do our part. She said his future depended on stability. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not ask if I was scared. She did not ask anything at all. After that, I stopped trying to talk to them about it. The only person I confided in was a coworker who noticed the way my hand kept drifting to my neck during meetings. She encouraged me to push harder for the specialist appointment. She said fear was normal, but neglecting it was not. I nodded, even though a part of me felt guilty for worrying about my own health when my parents constantly reminded me how much depended on Evan's progress. The appointment finally came, a date circled in red on my calendar, a lifeline. A moment that felt like it might lead to relief or terror or both. I looked at that date every morning the way some people look at sunrise waiting for light to break open the sky. Days before the appointment, the lump grew more tender. Sometimes I woke in the night gasping because it felt like something was pushing from the inside. The idea of cancer crept into my thoughts despite all my efforts to silence it. I imagined biopsy needles and sterile rooms. I imagined long treatment plans. I imagined myself trying to survive something enormous while my family argued about Evan's training weights in the next room. The night before the appointment, I could barely sleep. I paced my small room in the basement, trying to breathe around the fear knotted in my ribs. I replayed the doctor's concerned expression again and again in my mind. I imagined what the specialist might say. I imagined hearing words that could unravel the rest of my life. And still, my parents did not ask about the appointment. They spent the evening reviewing Evan's pitching footage and discussing which tryouts he should attend next month. My mother reminded me twice to make sure the gas tank was full if I was planning to drive him anywhere that weekend. I nodded but said nothing. I curled up in bed later with my hand pressed lightly to the lump, feeling the throb of a future I could not predict. It was the only thing in my life that was undeniably mine, even if I wished it were not. By the time morning came, I was exhausted from worry, yet determined to go. I had waited too long to give up now. I dressed carefully, choosing a scarf that draped loosely around my neck. I grabbed my referral papers, my insurance card, and a water bottle because my throat felt tight. I told myself that whatever happened, I deserved to know the truth. As I stepped out into the hallway, I heard Evan laughing loudly downstairs as he rummaged through the kitchen. That sound clashed sharply with the fear crawling under my skin. I paused on the stairwell, gripping the railing, grounding myself in a decision I already knew I would have to fight for. I did not know the fight would come so quickly or that it would knock me to the floor. All I knew was the truth sitting heavy in my throat. My health mattered even if they refused to see it. The morning of the appointment began like every other morning in that house, except for the tightness in my throat and the quiet resolve sitting heavy beneath my ribs. The sky outside was pale and cold, the kind of light that makes everything look clearer than you want it to. I moved through the kitchen carefully, still sore from a restless night spent waking to the pressure of the lump in my neck, and I set my referral papers on the counter where I would not forget them. The kettle hissed softly on the stove while I poured myself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would soothe the rawness in my throat. I checked my phone again, even though I knew the appointment time by heart. Today was supposed to be the day I finally got answers. The day I stopped pretending the fear living under my skin was something I could ignore. As I reached for my jacket, I heard heavy footsteps on the stairs, followed by the familiar slam of a cabinet door. Evan stormed into the kitchen with the same frantic energy he always carried on mornings he had training or auditions or tryouts. He tossed his baseball bag onto the table with a loud thud that rattled my mug. He did not look at me. He never needed to. He simply expected me to fall into place when he barked an order. He opened the fridge, grabbed an energy drink, and chugged half of it before turning toward me. He demanded that I drive him across the city for a semi-pro baseball tryout, insisting his truck would not start. He said it like a fact etched into stone, as if my day and my life were already scheduled around his needs. I told him calmly that I could not. I told him I had a medical appointment I had waited months for. A biopsy appointment. Something serious. Something urgent. I said it with a steadiness I did not entirely feel, but I braced myself anyway. He paused mid-sip and slowly lowered the can. For a moment, he looked confused, like the word no was foreign to him. Then his confusion twisted into irritation, then into a sharp, vicious anger I had seen simmering beneath the surface for years. He asked why I could not reschedule. I told him, "You do not reschedule a biopsy." He scoffed, calling me dramatic, accusing me of overreacting to nothing more than a swollen gland. I tried to explain that doctors suspected something more, that this appointment could not wait, that I was scared. He waved me off with a laugh that sliced deeper than any insult. He said people who were really sick did not walk around complaining. He stepped closer and pointed a finger at my chest, saying that today was the most important day of his life, that scouts would be there, that coaches would be watching, that missing this tryout could ruin everything. He spoke as if my life had no parallel importance, as if I existed only to support his ambitions. I repeated myself again. I have to go to the hospital. My throat tightened as I said it because the thought of missing the appointment terrified me more than his anger ever could. He stared at me with disbelief, like he was waiting for the punchline to a joke. When I did not back down, the disbelief vanished and something darker rose in its place. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the artificial berry sweetness of the drink on his breath. He accused me of doing this on purpose, of trying to sabotage him, of being jealous. Jealous of what I could not imagine because everything our family possessed went to him. My hands trembled as I tried to pick up my jacket again. I turned to leave the room, but he blocked the doorway with his entire body. His voice dropped into the tone he used only when he wanted to intimidate me. He told me I would drive him, that it was my job, that he had earned this chance and I needed to support it. Something inside me snapped at that word. Job. As if I owed him my time and my body and my life. I told him clearly and firmly that I was going to the hospital even if I had to walk there. His jaw twitched, his fist clenched. He accused me of ruining everything, and then the room exploded around me. He swung without hesitation. His fist connected with my cheek so hard my head snapped sideways. Pain shot through my skull, and I fell into the counter, the edge slamming into my ribs before the floor rose up and swallowed me whole. My vision pulsed black and white like a broken television screen. My ears filled with a loud ringing that drowned out his voice. I tasted blood spreading across my tongue as my teeth cut into my lip. The world around me spun violently before settling into a slow, disorienting drift. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the blurry outlines of my parents standing in the doorway. My mother crossed her arms. My father shook his head. Neither moved toward me. Neither asked if I was hurt. Instead, my mother demanded to know why I was causing problems on an important morning. She said I should have taken him without complaining. My father added that Evan's future mattered, and I needed to stop being selfish. Their words washed over me like cold water. I lay there for a moment with my cheek throbbing and my ribs aching, feeling the familiar weight of their expectations press down on me. But beneath the pain, something else stirred, a clarity, a rising resolve like a quiet flame. I pushed myself up slowly, every motion sending sparks of pain shooting through my body. My vision blurred and steadied again. I pressed my fingers to my cheek and felt the swelling already forming. My mother muttered that I should clean myself up before I embarrassed the family. Evan was rummaging through drawers for keys, cursing about how he did not have time for this. I watched him move around the room like nothing had happened, like knocking me unconscious was just another minor inconvenience. And for the first time in my life, I did not shrink. I stood. My legs were shaking, but I stood. I held onto the counter until the room stopped tilting. My parents turned away as if they were done with the conversation, but there had been no conversation at all. Just orders. Just expectations. Just the same script I had followed my entire life. I knew then in that moment, with blood still warm on my lip and my cheek pulsing with pain, that something fundamental had changed in me. I whispered the truth to myself because no one else would say it. I deserve to live. I deserve to know if I am sick. I deserve to be more than this. I took my jacket, my papers, and my bag from the chair in the corner. I did not ask for permission. I did not apologize. I walked out of that kitchen with the taste of iron on my tongue and a calm I had never felt before. I moved through the hallway like someone half dreaming and half waking, the kind of slow-motion clarity that happens only when a breaking point has already been crossed, and there is no part of you left that believes things can go back to how they were. My cheek throbbed with a deep, pulsing ache that radiated into my jaw and up toward my temple. Every step sent a faint tremor through my ribs where the counter had caught me, but none of it felt as sharp or as disorienting as the realization that the people standing in the next room would never see what they had done, not the way I saw it now. I climbed the stairs, carefully gripping the railing with fingers that still quivered from the aftermath of the hit. The house was so familiar that I could walk it blind, but this time every detail demanded attention. The chipped paint on the banister. The family photos that lined the wall, all of them centered on Evan, his face bright and triumphant in every frame. The way my own reflection flickered in the glass of those frames out of place, incidental, easy to overlook, exactly as they had taught me to believe. My room looked the same as it always did, small, crowded, and temporary, despite the years I had spent trying to make it feel like home. I closed the door behind me and leaned back against it, letting out a long, shaky breath. For a moment, I simply stared at my bag slumped beside the bed. I had packed nothing extraordinary the night before, just as I had done countless times for work trips, but today it looked like a lifeline. I moved slowly toward it, each motion deliberate, as if I were afraid that if I rushed, I would lose my nerve. I opened the bag and added the essentials with steady hands. My wallet, my insurance card, the envelope with my referral papers, a small pouch of toiletries, my laptop and charger, a few articles of clothing folded with the kind of precision you use when you know you might not come back for a long time. I walked to the desk and retrieved the small folder where I kept every medical document I had collected over the past months. Blood work printouts, appointment confirmations, a copy of the referral, notes I had written to myself about symptoms I was too embarrassed to say out loud. I slid the folder into the bag and zipped it slowly, the sound small but final. I looked around the room again, waiting for some part of me to protest, to insist this was too drastic, too emotional, too reckless, but that protest never came. The house felt like a place I had already left, even though my body was still inside it. I checked my phone. My hands trembled again, but not from fear. Something steadier pushed through me now, something that felt more like relief than panic. I stepped into the hallway and for a moment I stood perfectly still listening. Below me, I could hear my mother talking in short, clipped sentences, probably leaving a voicemail for one of Evan's coaches. My father's voice drifted in too calmer, but full of the tired disdain he reserved for any moment that required him to acknowledge me. They spoke about schedules and expectations and errands as if nothing unusual had happened, as if their daughter had not been knocked to the ground minutes earlier by the son they worshipped. I reached the top of the stairs and paused. My breath felt too loud. My heartbeat echoed in my ears. I half expected someone to call out to demand an explanation or tell me to stop or accuse me of making a scene. But the house did what it had always done when I needed something. It looked straight past me. I descended the stairs slowly. My bag bumped lightly against my hip. In the kitchen, my mother was wiping down the counter, her movements sharp and irritated. She glanced up only long enough to give me a look that conveyed inconvenience, not concern. My father was checking his watch. Neither asked where I was going. Neither noticed the bruise forming across my cheek or the stiff way I held my ribs. Evan was outside pacing near the driveway on the phone with someone still complaining loudly about how I had ruined his morning. None of them saw me. And for the first time in my life, that invisibility did not crush me. It freed me. I moved toward the front door. My mother's voice drifted after me, annoyed and dismissive. She said something about not slamming the door. My father said something about making better choices. Evan shouted something about how I owed him. Their words floated behind me, weightless, powerless, irrelevant. My hand wrapped around the doorknob. The metal was cold, almost grounding. I opened the door slowly, letting the morning air wash over me. It felt crisp and clean in a way I had never noticed before. I stepped outside with a calmness that did not match the chaos raging behind me. The door clicked shut with a softness that somehow sounded louder than any scream I could have thrown back at them. I walked to my car without looking back. I unlocked it, slid into the driver's seat, and for a moment I simply rested my hands on the steering wheel. The silence felt unreal. I could still hear the faint ringing in my ears from the hit, but underneath it was something steadier, a pulse I had not felt in years. My own. I started the engine. It hummed to life. I backed out of the driveway slowly, watching the house shrink in my rearview mirror. The curtains shifted slightly in the front room, but no one came out. No one followed. No one cared. But for once, that truth did not wound me. It clarified me. I drove toward the hospital with the imprint of Evan's fist still warm on my skin and the weight of my entire life lifting one breath at a time. The drive to the hospital felt strangely quiet, as if the world outside my car had softened its edges just enough for me to breathe without flinching. My cheek throbbed each time the tires hit a seam in the pavement, but I kept one hand lightly pressed against the swelling as though holding it in place could keep everything else from unraveling. Traffic moved steadily around me, indifferent to the chaos I had left behind. I rolled down the window a crack, hoping the cold air would clear the fog gathering behind my eyes. Every time I swallowed, I felt the lump in my neck push back, a reminder of why I was doing this, and why going back to that house was no longer an option. When I finally pulled into the hospital's parking garage, my hands shook so badly that I had to grip the steering wheel for a full minute before I trusted myself to move. The garage was dim and echoing, full of that stale concrete smell that clings to winter mornings. I locked my car and walked toward the elevator, each step steadying me in a way I did not expect. By the time I reached the clinic waiting room, my heartbeat had settled into a slow, heavy thud that matched the rhythm pulsing through the bruise on my face. The receptionist looked up as I approached the desk, her polite smile faltering slightly when she took in the discoloration spreading across my cheek. She asked softly if I needed help. I nodded and handed her my paperwork. Her eyes flicked to my cheek again, but she did not ask questions. She simply guided me toward the chairs and told me the nurse would call me soon. I sat near a window where the early light cast a pale glow across the floor. A few older patients sat nearby reading magazines. One woman kept her hand on her son's shoulder in a quiet, steady rhythm of comfort. I tried to steady myself in the same way. I touched my chest, breathed in, breathed out. The pain in my ribs reminded me of the counter edge slamming against bone. For a moment, I wondered if I should tell someone what had happened, but I pushed the thought aside. Survival had taught me silence. The nurse called my name a few minutes later. Her eyes widened a fraction when she saw my face, but she kept her expression professional as she guided me down a long hallway lined with closed doors. When we reached the exam room, she spoke gently while taking my vitals. She asked if I was feeling dizzy. I said a little. She asked if I had hurt myself in a fall. My throat tightened, the answer stuck behind old habits. She did not press further. Instead, she helped me onto the exam table and said the doctor would be in shortly. I stared at the wall across from me, a blank pastel square without any decoration. My fingers curled into my palms. My thoughts drifted like a slow-moving current, carrying months of fear along with the memory of the hit, the impact, the cold disregard in my parents' voices. When the door opened, I straightened instinctively. Dr. Melissa Drake stepped inside, holding a tablet and a calm confidence that filled the room before she spoke. She greeted me by name, her voice warm but steady. She introduced herself, said she had reviewed my referral, and apologized for the long wait I had endured. Then she looked up fully and saw my face. The shift in her expression was immediate and unmistakable. Not shock, not pity, but alertness. A quiet readiness. She set her tablet down slowly and moved closer, studying the bruise with the focus of someone trained to see what others overlook. She asked who had done this to me. The question landed in my stomach with the clatter of a dropped tray. I opened my mouth to lie because that was the reflex my entire life had taught me, but the lie stuck. My throat tightened. My eyes burned. I said nothing, and in that silence she understood. She did not push. She did not threaten. She simply sat on the rolling stool, rested her hands on her knees, and said she was here to help me whether I explained or not. Something fragile inside me cracked. Not the violent crack I felt when Evan hit me. Something gentler, deeper. I told her everything. The months of pain. The lump. The waiting lists. The dismissal from my family. The hit. The fall. The bruise. The fear that had been spreading through me like a slow-moving tide. She listened without interrupting once. When I finished, the room felt impossibly quiet, as if the building itself were holding its breath. She stood and stepped closer, examining the lump in my neck with careful precision. She explained what the biopsy would involve, how long it would take, what I might feel. Her voice was matter of fact, but her eyes stayed kind, steadying me with every sentence. The biopsy was quick, only a few minutes, but my hands trembled long after it was done. She placed a small bandage over the site and told me the results would take several days. Then, she asked the question that broke something deep inside me. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay after this?" The word safe hit harder than Evan's fist. I wanted to answer yes out of instinct, but the truth rose up too fast to bury. I shook my head. I told her my lease had ended, that I had been staying with my parents when I was not traveling for work, that I could not go back there now. She paused only long enough to make sure I was looking at her. Then she said she had a guest room. She said she would not let me leave the hospital without knowing I was going someplace safe. She said she had seen too many people go back after the first hit, and she refused to let me be one of them. Her certainty stunned me. Not the offer itself, but the way she said it without hesitation, as though my safety mattered in a way I had never been allowed to believe. I tried to protest, embarrassed, overwhelmed, but she shut it down with a single quiet sentence. "You deserve to be protected." She handed me a bottle of water and told me to take my time. When I finally followed her out of the room, the hallway looked different. The building felt warmer. My steps felt steadier. Leaving the hospital beside her felt like stepping out of a cage I had lived in so long I forgot it had a door. At her house, later that morning, she gave me a spare key, a soft blanket, and a place at her kitchen table. She brewed tea and placed a bag of frozen peas on my cheek with the kind of care that made something in my chest ache with disbelief. I watched her move around the kitchen with an ease that made the air feel lighter. When she asked for my insurance card so she could help me file the hospital paperwork, I handed her my wallet. Neither of us knew that a darker truth was waiting inside it, a truth that would shatter the last illusions I had about my family and push everything that came after into motion. The kitchen in Dr. Melissa Drake's house felt impossibly calm compared to the chaos I had come from a small, safe bubble where the air did not vibrate with tension or expectation. The soft hum of her dishwasher, the distant sound of her golden retriever shifting on the couch, even the gentle clink of her mug as she set it on the counter created a rhythm my body was not used to. I sat at her table with a blanket around my shoulders, the frozen peas pressed against my bruised cheek, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the trembling in my hands begin to slow. She asked for my insurance card so she could help me process the hospital paperwork. I reached into my bag, pulled out my wallet, and slid it toward her without thinking. I had done that hundreds of times at clinics and pharmacies, always numb to the routine. But her reaction was different. She opened my wallet and paused, her brows drawing together. She flipped through the cards once, then again, more slowly. I watched confusion settle across her face, followed by a level of concern that made the hairs on my arms rise. She spread the cards on the table between us. More than a dozen, different banks, different colors, different credit limits printed in small metallic lettering across the tops. She asked gently but firmly why I had so many open credit cards. My stomach dropped. I told her I only had two, my debit card and a single credit card I used for work trips. She looked back at the table, then at me, her expression tightening. She asked if she could run a credit report with me so she could verify my insurance information. Her tone carried no judgment, only caution. I nodded, my throat suddenly dry. She opened her laptop and logged into the secure patient portal she used for verifying identity for insurance coverage. She explained that in certain cases, especially when insurance records looked inconsistent, doctors were allowed to request an updated credit report for verification. I watched her type my name, my address, and my social security number into the system. The cursor blinked for a moment. Then the screen populated with numbers and lists and balances that made no sense at first because my brain refused to process them. When the truth snapped into focus, it felt like the floor dropped out beneath me. Total unsecured debt in my name, $165,000. 11 credit cards, all opened within the last 3 years. All maxed out. All tied to transactions that mapped perfectly onto the timeline of Evan's baseball career. I stared at the screen, unable to move, unable to breathe. Line by line, the report revealed where the money had gone. Thousands spent on batting cages in different states. Equipment orders from sporting goods stores I had never stepped into. Charges for hotel stays in cities I had never visited. Payments to trainers. Payments to private coaches. Payments for nutritional supplements from a company that had been under investigation for distributing unregulated substances. Each transaction hammered into my skull with brutal clarity. Evan's tournaments in Phoenix. Evan's travel to Florida. Evan's training programs in California. I saw the dates and realized they aligned perfectly with the months my mother told me they were struggling for gas money, the months my father pressured me to pick up more work, the months I ate soup for dinner because I thought helping them meant helping the family. My name was on every card. My signature even appeared on applications I had never filled out. Melissa read silently, the muscles in her jaw tightening as she scrolled. When she reached the bottom of the report, she closed her laptop slowly, deliberately, as if giving me time to catch up to the truth I had been living in the dark from. She looked at me and said in a voice both steady and soft that my family had not only abused me physically and emotionally, they had drained my financial future without hesitation or remorse. I shook my head because some part of me still wanted to reject it, still wanted to believe there was a misunderstanding, still wanted to think they would never do something so calculated. I told her they would not do that, that maybe someone had stolen my identity, that maybe there had been an error. Melissa opened the laptop again and pointed to the application signatures. My signature. Except the curves were wrong. My handwriting, but not my hand. A scanned copy. She flipped to the next. The address listed was my parents' house. The phone number listed as a contact was my mother's. One application even listed Evan as an authorized user. My breath shook as the pieces fell into place, shattering every fragile excuse I had built over the years to justify their behavior. They had not just used me. They had planned it. They had created an entirely separate financial life using my name while I was busy working overtime and wiring money home out of guilt and obligation. Melissa watched my face as I processed it. She reached across the table and placed her hand lightly over mine. She told me to breathe. She told me that none of this was my fault. I tried to ask how something like this could happen without me knowing, how they could have opened account after account, how banks could approve applications with signatures that were not mine. She explained gently that people with access to personal documents and social security numbers could easily commit identity theft, especially when the victim trusted them. She said family-based financial abuse was more common than I imagined. That did not make it hurt less. The weight of realization pressed so heavily on my chest that for a moment I could not inhale. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling, the edges of my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed. In one morning, I had gone from fearing a possible diagnosis to learning that the people who raised me had quietly dismantled my financial future piece by piece, while thanking me for being so helpful. I whispered a question I was almost afraid to ask. How long would it take to fix something like this? Melissa did not lie. She said years, maybe longer. She said some of the damage might never fully reverse. She said rebuilding credit after this level of fraud was difficult, but not impossible. Her honesty steadied me even as it broke me. I pressed the frozen peas harder against my cheek, the cold helping me stay grounded while my entire world collapsed again in a new direction. I thought about the nights I had worked late to help them, the birthdays I skipped, the bills I covered, the fear I swallowed, the sacrifices I made, all while they used my name as currency to fund Evan's dreams. My hands shook with something hotter than fear, something sharper, anger, not the explosive kind, not the kind that mirrors Evan's rage. This was quiet, cold, exact, a realization that everything they had taken from me had to be paid back. Melissa watched the shift in my expression and nodded as if understanding a silent vow I had not yet spoken. She told me she would help me contact the credit bureaus. She told me she would help me file reports. She told me I would not do this alone. I placed both hands on the table to steady myself and whispered the truth that was forming in me with the weight of inevitability. They will pay for this, not out of revenge, out of consequence, out of justice. Out of necessity. Melissa nodded once more, her voice calm when she spoke. Good, because this is only the beginning and you deserve more than what they left you with. I sat in her kitchen, the frozen peas melting slowly against my skin, the bruise throbbing my neck, aching where the biopsy needle had gone in, and understood with final clarity that the life I thought I had was gone. A new one was forming around me piece by piece, built on truth I could no longer pretend was anything else. The morning after Melissa showed me the credit report, I woke up in her guest room with the lingering ache of the biopsy radiating down my neck and the fading sting of the bruise pulsing under my skin. For a moment, I lay still staring at the ceiling, letting the silence settle over me in a way that felt both unfamiliar and strangely comforting. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. The vibration was sharp and insistent, rattling against the wood. I reached for it cautiously, expecting another appointment reminder, or maybe a message from work. Instead, the screen lit up with a barrage of notifications. Group messages, missed calls, social media tags, posts, mentions, dozens of them. I sat up slowly, my heartbeat drumming against my ribs as I opened the first one. It was a video. Grainy, shaky, recorded from the stands at the training facility where Evan's tryout had been held. The clip began with him standing on the mound, adjusting his cap, preparing to pitch. He looked confident, loose, ready to impress. Then, two staff members wearing navy jackets approached him. Their voices were muffled, but the captions added by the person filming told the story clearly enough. Randomized testing protocol. Step off the mound. Come with us. Evan resisted at first. You could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his head snapped toward the coaches in disbelief. The crowd murmured. Someone zoomed in. A few seconds later, he was escorted off the field, his bag taken from him. The video cut abruptly to the comments section where strangers speculated wildly about what had happened. I scrolled each message, hitting me with a strange mix of disbelief and inevitability. Did he pop hot? Heard rumors. That kid's been juicing for years. Called it. Parents pushed too hard. No surprise. I backed out of the thread and opened another notification, then another, and another. Each one painted the same unfolding disaster. Evan had failed the drug test, not borderline levels, not ambiguous results. He had tested positive for multiple banned substances, anabolic compounds, hormone enhancers, ratios so high the lab flagged them as artificially elevated beyond any question of contamination. By mid-morning, the story spread across local sports forums. By noon, it had jumped to regional boards. By early afternoon, it hit national amateur baseball pages, complete with screenshots of his stats footage of his throwing velocity and side-by-side photos comparing his physique from 2 years ago to now. The comments were brutal, cold, clinical, a kind of public dissection that spared no sympathy. When you gamble everything on cheating, the fall hits harder. Career over. That family always acted like they were better than everyone. There were even whispers from rival parents claiming they had suspected something for years. I stared at the screen, feeling something I could not immediately name. Not satisfaction, not joy. Something quieter. Something like breath returning after being held too long. I was still processing it when the first text from my mother arrived. She sent it from a new number after I had blocked her old one. The message appeared on my screen in a long, screaming paragraph, accusing me of distracting Evan, of stressing him out, of not being there to support him, as though my absence had somehow created the chemicals in his bloodstream. Before I could finish reading it, the next message arrived. Then the next. Then the next. Each one more frantic than the last. My father's messages came in next, shorter but sharper, filled with accusations about how I had abandoned the family and ruined everything. He called me selfish again. Ungrateful. He said I was to blame for Evan's emotional instability during the tryout. None of them mentioned the lump in my neck. None of them asked if I was okay. None of them acknowledged the bruise they had all witnessed. Then Evan began calling. His name lit up my phone over and over, vibrating the screen with increasing urgency. When I did not answer, he switched to text messages. At first, he tried to bargain. Come back. Help fix this. Tell them I'm clean. Then anger. You did this. You messed with my head. Then threats. You owe me. You owe all of us. Then desperation. Please. Please help. They were going to draft me. Please answer. The messages blurred together in a frantic spiral, each one louder in tone, even though he could not raise his voice through a screen. I blocked him. The moment I did, my phone went quiet for a breathless second. Then new messages appeared from numbers I did not recognize. Parents of his teammates, coaches, people who had never spoken to me directly before. They blamed me too. They said I should talk to the testing officials, claim he had been under unusual stress. They said his future depended on me stepping up. Me, the sister they ignored until they needed a sacrifice. Melissa entered the room, then knocking gently, even though the door was open. She carried a cup of tea in one hand. When she saw my face, she set the mug down and sat beside me. She asked what had happened. I showed her the messages, the video, the comments, the accusations. She read everything slowly, methodically, her face tightening with each swipe of her finger. Then she placed the phone face down on the bed and said with quiet certainty that none of this was my responsibility, that the collapse unfolding online was the consequence of Evan's choices, that I needed to breathe. I nodded, but the weight in my chest did not ease. When you grow up being blamed for problems you did not create, it takes a long time for your body to stop reacting to accusations as though they are truth. Melissa reached for my hand and squeezed it gently. She reminded me I was safe. She reminded me I was out of that house. She reminded me that everything happening to him now had nothing to do with me. My phone buzzed again. A voicemail this time. From my mother. I did not open it. Then another. From my father. I deleted that one without listening. Then a text from an unknown number containing a link to an online sports article. The headline nearly stole my breath. Rising baseball prospect under investigation after failing mandatory drug test. Sources cite multiple banned substances, potential lifetime ban. Beneath the headline was a photo of Evan taken at a previous tournament. He looked confident, ambitious, untouchable. The contrast between that image and the crumbling narrative beneath it was stark enough to make me dizzy. Messages kept coming, each one reminding me that the empire my parents had built around Evan's future was collapsing in real time, and there was nothing any of them could do to stop it. Not my parents, not the coaches, not him. Certainly not me. As the afternoon light faded, I sat in Melissa's living room, watching headline after headline refresh across my screen. Each update chipped away another piece of the illusion my parents had spent years constructing. The illusion that Evan was destined for greatness, that he was special, that he was above consequences. The truth stood in front of me stripped bare for the world to see. He was human, flawed, responsible for his choices, and finally facing the fallout. For the first time in my life, I felt no guilt for something that was not mine to carry. Only clarity, only distance. Only the quiet, growing understanding that justice sometimes begins at the exact moment someone else's world falls apart. The night Evan's collapse went public, I sat in Melissa's living room with the lights dimmed and the curtains drawn, holding a glass of water between my palms, as if the warmth from my hands could settle the earthquake inside me. The messages from my family had stopped only because I had blocked every number they had ever used, but the weight of their words still buzzed faintly under my skin, a leftover static from years of conditioning. Melissa sat across from me, her posture steady, her eyes patient, waiting for me to breathe in a way that did not sound like drowning. When I finally exhaled, she asked a question that should have terrified me, but instead pierced straight through the numbness. What do you want to do next? No one had ever asked me that. Not my parents, not Evan, not even myself. My whole life had been built around reacting, fixing, supporting, absorbing impact after impact without ever being given the option to choose a direction. Now the choice hung in front of me like a door I had never dared to touch. I told her the truth. I want accountability. I want them to face consequences. I want my life back. Melissa nodded as if she had expected exactly that answer. She disappeared into her office and returned with a card she placed gently in front of me. Mason Delgado, financial crimes attorney. She said she had worked with him before when helping patients whose family members stole prescription pads or insurance information. She said he was relentless. She said he did not back down, not even when cases were messy or emotional. She asked if I wanted her to call him. I nodded. She dialed. Mason answered on the second ring. She introduced herself, then me, then gave a concise summary of what had happened. Physical assault, identity theft, 11 credit cards opened in my name, $165,000 in fraudulent charges, potential tax fraud, insurance fraud, prior knowledge and coordination from multiple family members. When she finished, Mason asked one question in a low, controlled voice. Is she safe right now? Melissa looked at me. I nodded. He told us to come to his office first thing in the morning. The next day, we sat in a glass office overlooking downtown. Mason looked nothing like the lawyers my parents used during property disputes or tax loophole seasons. He looked younger, sharper. His eyes were precise, missing nothing. He asked me to start from the beginning. I told him everything. Not just the credit cards, but the years of pressure, the financial manipulation, the way my parents dismissed my health concerns, the physical assault that finally pushed me out the door. I told him about the doping scandal and the online fallout. I told him how they had always expected me to sacrifice without question. He listened without interrupting, but his pen moved across his legal pad at a steady, relentless pace. When I finished, he tapped the pad lightly and said the words that felt like oxygen. "We can prosecute this." He explained that what my family had done was not simply unethical, it was criminal. The forged applications constituted wire fraud. Using my personal information without consent was identity theft. Shipping credit cards through the mail counted as mail fraud. Using the cards for Evan's tournaments created evidence of interstate financial crimes. If any of the funds crossed state lines, the FBI had jurisdiction. If any of the purchases were written off as business expenses, the IRS had jurisdiction. If Evan's supplements involved illegal distribution, that was another layer entirely. Melissa glanced toward me as Mason continued outlining the legal branches. I sat very still, absorbing each word as if he were mapping a route out of a burning building. Then he asked the question that would determine everything. "Do you want civil court or federal prosecution?" Civil court would involve suing my family for damages. Financial repayment, potential liens, debt recovery. Federal prosecution meant prison, actual prison, criminal records, felony charges, national news, a permanent stain on their lives that could never be erased. I thought about the bruise on my cheek. I thought about the 11 credit cards. I thought about the lump in my neck. I thought about every time they told me Evan mattered more than I did. I thought about walking out the door while they did not bother to stop me. I looked up and said federal. Mason nodded as if he had already known. He began assembling a binder immediately. He had me sign multiple release forms to obtain my credit bureau files and insurance records. He made copies of my identification, my medical paperwork from the hospital, and the biopsy record. Then he asked if I wanted to file a police report for the assault. I hesitated, not because I wanted to protect Evan, that part of me was gone, but because part of me still wondered whether my fall made it worse, whether I had somehow caused the severity of the injury. Mason looked me in the eye and said one sentence that settled the doubt. Victims do not cause their own assault. I filed the report. He sent everything that afternoon. Not to a local precinct that might drag its feet, not to a county investigator who might know my parents by name. He sent it straight to 4 federal offices, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI Denver Field Office, the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Colorado. Each packet contained copies of every forged application, every statement, every payment, every fraudulent charge, every difficult detail of the physical assault. Every documentation of Evan's doping scandal used not for revenge, but to show a pattern of parental enabling and willingness to break the law to support him. The next few weeks moved faster than I expected and slower than I wanted. Agents contacted me for statements. Investigators verified the credit applications. They tracked IP addresses. They subpoenaed bank records. They pulled transaction histories. They compared signatures. They reviewed Evan's authorized user access on several cards. The paper trail was devastating, and it was all theirs, not mine, not a misunderstanding, not a mistake, intentional, coordinated, repeated. One crisp morning while I sat at Melissa's dining table reviewing forms, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I answered cautiously. It was an agent from the IRS. He told me my father had been claiming Evan's tournaments as business expenses through his contracting company labeling travel equipment and training as operational costs. Tens of thousands of dollars falsely deducted. Years of tax fraud. My heart beat slowly and steadily as I wrote everything down. Days later, another agent called, this time from the Postal Inspection Service. They had tracked 3 of the credit cards to interstate mail routes. That alone justified federal charges. Then came the call from the FBI. The agent told me they had enough evidence to move forward with arrests. They would not tell me when. They never do. They only said to expect the news soon. When the news did come, it arrived with a photograph. A news alert appeared on my screen showing my father face down on the hood of his truck, two agents pinning his arms behind him in front of half his construction crew. They had arrested him on sight. Tax fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, mail fraud. He was taken into custody without bail. My mother was arrested the next day in a grocery store parking lot, still holding a bag of protein powder for Evan. She was escorted into a federal vehicle while shoppers watched in shock. Evan was last. Federal agents found him at a public field where he had gone to throw in an attempt to salvage the hope left in him. They seized his truck, his phone, his laptop, his gear, everything purchased with fraudulent funds. Social media exploded again, this time with mugshots, headlines, commentaries. The Quinn family, once so loudly proud of Evan's athletic promise, now splashed across national news for financial crimes and identity theft. For the first time, I felt something close to justice, not revenge, justice. A rebalancing of a scale that had been uneven my whole life. And as I sat in Melissa's kitchen reading the articles, her hand resting gently atop mine, I whispered something I had not allowed myself to believe until that moment. I am getting my life back. The morning of the sentencing hearing felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself had exhaled and was waiting to see what would happen next. I woke in Melissa's guest room before the alarm, my mind clear in a way it had not been in years, the kind of clarity that comes when fear has burned itself out and all that remains is truth. I moved slowly through the house, letting the warmth from her old hardwood floors travel up through my bare feet as though the building itself was grounding me. I dressed in simple clothes, a plain black blazer and dark slacks, nothing flashy or emotional, just enough to make me invisible in a room that would soon overflow with tension. Melissa offered to come with me, but I told her I needed to face this part alone. Not because I felt brave, but because the girl I used to be would never have walked into a federal courtroom unaccompanied. I needed to see who I had become. Downtown Denver was cold that morning. The kind of cold that made the air feel sharp, even though the sun was up. I parked several blocks away and walked the rest of the distance toward the Alfred A. Araj Federal Courthouse, its glass exterior reflecting a city that had no idea how much of my life had been buried behind those walls. Inside, the metal detector beeped mechanically as people filed through. Attorneys hurried past with briefcases. Journalists whispered to each other in corners. A few spectators waited in silence, clutching notebooks as if preparing to witness something heavy. I found courtroom 402 without asking for directions. My hands did not shake when I reached for the door. I stepped inside quietly and chose a seat in the very back row, tucked near the corner where the shadows softened the edges of the room. No one glanced at me. No one recognized me. For the first time in my life, I was in the same room as my family without them claiming any part of me. The prosecutor entered first, their suit crisp, their stack of folders thick, their expression neutral. They spoke briefly to the bailiff before taking a seat. A few minutes later, the courtroom doors opened again and my father was brought in. His appearance struck me harder than I expected. He looked smaller. His face was drawn, his posture hunched under the weight of the chain that circled his waist and wrists. His hair had thinned patches of gray spreading through it like frost. He scanned the courtroom slowly, searching for familiar faces, searching for anyone who might offer him comfort or solidarity. His eyes drifted across the room and passed right over me. He did not recognize me. Or maybe he refused to. My mother entered next, escorted by a probation officer. She wore wide-legged slacks that covered the ankle monitor strapped to her leg. Her shoulders were tense, her fingers twisted around each other as if they were knots she could not untie. She looked older than I had ever seen her, as if the facade she had once maintained with such pride had split down the middle and the exhaustion beneath had finally surfaced. Then Evan entered. He was not handcuffed but walked with caution, a deputy close behind him. His once confident stride had become a slow shuffle. His head lowered, his eyes empty in a way that made something in my chest tighten. I had imagined this moment many times, but I had never imagined feeling anything other than anger. Yet seeing him like that did not bring satisfaction. It brought understanding. Choices shape people. Consequences shape them more. None of them noticed me. Not yet. The judge entered the room, her black robe sweeping behind her as everyone rose. Her presence was steady, her gaze sharp and observant. She opened the session with a brief statement acknowledging the charges and confirming that all parties were present. The prosecutor stood and began outlining the plea agreements reached by each defendant. My father had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of aggravated identity theft, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The recommendation was 96 months in federal prison with no parole, followed by supervised release. My mother had pleaded guilty to conspiracy and misprision of felony, accepting responsibility for enabling and concealing the fraud. The recommendation was 60 months probation, the first 18 under home confinement plus full restitution. Evan had been offered adjudication withheld due to his age and cooperation with investigators, including evidence about the doping ring and the financial arrangements his parents orchestrated. He would serve 2 years of probation, complete mandatory drug treatment, and accept a lifetime ban from organized baseball at any level. After the prosecutor finished, the judge turned to each defendant one by one. When she addressed my father first, he stood with visible effort. His voice trembled as he delivered a rehearsed speech about regret and misguided intentions, claiming he never meant to hurt me, claiming he thought he could fix things before anyone found out. For a moment, he managed a tear. The judge listened without expression. Then she stated clearly that remorse only carries weight when it comes before consequences, not after. She sentenced him according to the recommendation. 96 months, federal custody, report date in 30 days. My father's knees buckled, and only the marshals flanking him prevented him from collapsing onto the floor. My mother burst into tears when the judge turned to her. She clutched a rosary and whispered apologies into the air, none of them directed toward me, because she still had not looked around the courtroom. She still thought I was somewhere far away. The judge told her that complicity was not weakness, and enabling harmful behavior was not love. She handed down the full probation sentence with strict conditions. My mother sobbed so hard her shoulders shook. When it was Evan's turn, he did not speak. He only nodded at his attorney when asked if he accepted the terms. The judge addressed him sternly, saying that while youth could excuse many mistakes, it could not erase the damage he had contributed to. She told him the ban was final, that baseball would no longer be his world, and that he needed to decide what kind of man he wanted to be when no one was telling him he was special. When the judge finished, she asked if there were any victims who wished to speak. Silence filled the room. A long moment passed. I remained seated in the back row, unseen, steady whole. I did not stand. I did not approach the podium. I did not offer anger or forgiveness. I did not owe them words. The courtroom began to empty slowly after the final ruling, each person gathering papers or adjusting jackets or avoiding eye contact. My father was escorted through a side door. My mother leaned against a bench, crying into her hands. Evan stood alone, staring at the floor, adrift in the space where his future had once been. For a brief moment, my mother looked up, scanning the room through blurry eyes. Her gaze drifted across the benches and then landed on me. Recognition flickered slowly like a match trying to spark in wet air. Her lips parted, her face crumpled. She whispered my name, though no sound came out. I simply looked at her. Not with hatred, not with pity, with distance, with clarity, with the understanding that blood ties mean nothing when the people attached to them refuse to see you as human. I held her gaze for one breath, then I looked away. I stood only after the room had nearly emptied, after the echoes faded and the walls seemed to exhale once more. I walked out of the courtroom, down the hallway, through the automatic doors, and into the cold, bright Colorado afternoon. The sun hit my face, and for the first time I felt the weight lift from my shoulders completely, final chains snapping quietly inside me. The mountains were sharp against the sky. The air felt thin and clean. This chapter of my life had closed in that courtroom, not with dramatic triumph, but with a quiet certainty that justice had been served and that I had reclaimed something I thought I had lost forever: myself. For weeks after the sentencing hearing, I felt as if I were learning how to breathe again, like some part of my body had been clenched for years without my permission and was only now releasing its grip. The silence in Melissa's home no longer felt foreign. It felt earned. It felt like mine. I woke each morning without bracing for impact, without listening for raised voices or footsteps pounding down a hallway or the sharp crack of frustration hitting the nearest object. Instead, there was the murmur of her coffee machine, the soft thump of her dog's tail against the couch, and the quiet hum of a life that asked nothing from me except that I live it. A week after the hearing, Melissa handed me an envelope with the results from my biopsy. I opened it slowly, afraid of the words etched on the page, afraid of what they might confirm about the lump in my neck and the storm my life had become. But the words were gentle. Benign thyroid nodule. No evidence of malignancy. For the first time in months, I exhaled without pain. Melissa hugged me with relief that felt like warmth spreading through cold stone. She told me this was the beginning, not the end. And she was right. I spent the next few months rebuilding parts of my life I had neglected for years. I worked with Mason to dispute fraudulent accounts. I filed paperwork with the credit bureaus. I learned what it meant to be financially independent without the shadow of someone else's expectations. At night, I sometimes touched the faint line under my jaw, the small scar left from the procedure, a reminder that healing did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it was quiet like a whisper of possibility. I found a small house that sat on a quiet street lined with cottonwoods whose branches arched over the sidewalk like a guard of honor. The house was old enough to creak when the weather changed, but sturdy in a way that made me feel grounded. Dark green siding, a porch that wrapped around to the back, wide windows that let the sunlight pour in every morning, a yard big enough for a garden I did not yet know how to grow, and maybe a dog of my own someday. When I signed the papers and the keys dropped into my hand, my throat tightened with something that felt like wonder. The first night I slept there on a mattress laid directly on the floor because the moving truck had been delayed. I curled under a blanket and listened to the quiet. No shouting, no door slamming, no sense of walking on eggshells around people who could not see me. Just me. Me and the old bones of a new home. The best sleep of my life. I began to settle into routines that felt like luxuries. Long walks through the neighborhood after work. Weekends spent repainting old cabinets and choosing curtains that made the rooms feel soft. Coffee on the porch while the sun rose. For the first time in years, my life unfolded without crisis, without manipulation, without guilt. And I cherished every moment. But there was one thing I knew I needed to do before I could fully close the door on my past. Months after sentencing on an afternoon painted gold with the warmth of early autumn, I found myself driving down a familiar road I had once avoided with every fiber of my being. Highway 93 curved gently toward Littleton, the mountains glowing in the distance like they were welcoming me rather than warning me. I had not planned the detour. My hands simply steered the wheel while my heart remained steady. I turned onto Mapler Lane, a place that once felt like the center of my universe. The place where I had learned to remain small. The place where sacrifice was expected and silence rewarded. But now the house looked different. A bright red sold sign stood proudly on the lawn. A moving truck backed into the driveway. A young couple carried boxes inside, laughing with the kind of exhausted joy that comes from beginning something new. On the front porch, a little girl blew bubbles into the air, her laughter ringing like a bell, like freedom itself. The yard had changed too. The batting cage was gone, the floodlights dismantled. The grass had finally returned to a normal yard instead of a shrine built for a boy who believed the world owed him everything. I slowed my car to a careful crawl, both hands steady on the wheel. No tremor, no hesitation. The woman noticed me, smiled with easy kindness, and waved. Reflex made me lift one hand in return. Simple. Human. Nothing like the cold, rigid tension that used to accompany every interaction at that address. As I pulled forward, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The little girl ran through the yard, chasing bubbles, her small feet landing exactly where I had once stood, counting fastballs in the dark, waiting for the night to quiet so I could sleep. The weight of that image settled gently in my chest. Not painful, not angry, just a soft echo of something that used to hurt and no longer could. I held on to the sight for a single second. Then I pressed the accelerator, merging back onto the road without looking back. The past did not reach for me. It simply faded into the distance like a chapter closed cleanly. As the miles stretched ahead, I realized something with quiet certainty. They had lost everything. Their reputation, their house, their golden child's future, their sense of control, their illusion of invincibility. And I had gained a life that finally belonged to me. A home, safety, freedom, the ability to breathe without flinching, the right to exist without apology. The sky above the mountains glowed with evening light as I drove north toward a future that was wide open and fully mine. I smiled without checking the mirror to see who might be watching, and I did not stop smiling the entire way home. When I finally pulled into my driveway that evening, the sky had settled into that soft blue-gray that only appears for a few quiet minutes before night takes over entirely, and I sat there with my hands resting loosely on the steering wheel, feeling the hum of the engine fade and the silence rise to meet me. And something inside me softened in a way I had not felt in years, because for the first time in my life, I was not bracing for the next blow or the next demand or the next crisis, shaped like a family obligation, and I realized that healing does not always roar. Sometimes it arrives gently like a door left open just wide enough to step through, and once you cross it there is no going back. And if you have ever grown up in a home where your worth was measured only by how much pain you could endure, or how much you could give without breaking, I want you to hear this. You are not alone, and you are not imagining it. And you are not too sensitive or too dramatic or too difficult for wanting to be treated like a human being who deserves safety and tenderness and space to breathe. And if anyone ever told you that someone else's dreams mattered more than your health, your body, your future, let my story stand as proof that their cruelty does not define the rest of your life. I spent years believing that sacrifice was love, that endurance was loyalty, that silence was strength, and it took a single moment, a single hit, a single breath on a cold morning to finally understand that survival is not the same as living, and that sometimes the first act of freedom is simply walking away, even when they tell you you have no right to, and maybe your family did not take out credit cards in your name, or spend your savings on someone else's future, or scream at you for choosing your own life. But maybe they took pieces of you in quieter ways, little cuts you learned to hide because admitting the pain made you feel weak. But I promise you, there is nothing weak about wanting more than a life lived in someone else's shadow. If any part of my story echoes in your bones, if you felt that shift in your chest when I walked out the door, or when I sat in that courtroom, or when I saw that sold sign on the lawn, then maybe this is the moment you needed to hear that you deserve a life that does not hurt, to wake up and you deserve peace. You deserve safety. You deserve to be seen, not used, not drained, not dismissed. And if you are standing at the edge of your own breaking point, wondering if it is too late for you, let me be the one to tell you it is not, because healing can begin at any moment. Even this one and your future can still be yours. Even if your past tried to convince you otherwise, if you have ever been the one who kept the family together while breaking quietly behind closed doors, or the one who was told to stay silent while someone else was praised, or the one who learned to shrink so others could shine. I see you, and I want you to know that your story matters. Your voice matters, your freedom matters. So if my journey meant anything to you, if you saw yourself in even a single line, then tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what part of this hit hardest. Tell me what chapter of your life you are ready to reclaim. I read every comment, and I carry your stories with me because no one heals alone and no one finds their voice in silence. Tell me your story. I am listening.